What would you do if the only companion you had left in this world was suddenly slipping away? This is the story of a war veteran who had already lost everything: his home, his family, his place in the world. All that remained was his loyal K9, the one soul who never left his side. But one tragic day in the forest, a rattlesnake's bite nearly took that bond away forever. What happened next will break your heart, and then lift it higher than you thought possible. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story of courage, loyalty, and second chances. The Oregon forest in late autumn was quiet beneath a pale sky. The morning air damp and cool, the mist curling between tall evergreens and settling over the moss-covered ground, carrying the smell of wet pine and distant rain. Jack Miller, a man of 45, stood at the edge of the clearing near his cabin, a weathered figure shaped by years of service and the weight of memories that never seemed to loosen their grip. His chestnut hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was cut unevenly as if he had long stopped caring about neatness. A thin beard lined with silver framed his angular jaw, the kind of beard that grows when a man lives more with silence than mirrors. His shoulders were broad but slightly stooped, not from age but from the invisible burden of war. He had seen too much, too many friends buried, too many cities torn apart, and he had returned from the desert not with medals that meant anything, but with shadows lodged in his chest. The doctors had named it PTSD, but Jack thought of it more as a thief. It stole sleep, it stole laughter, it stole the simple ease of being in one's own skin. The cabin behind him was small, built of rough pine logs darkened by rain and smoke. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a stone chimney, but it was more than enough for a man who wanted nothing more than quiet. The porch sagged, the shutters hung slightly crooked, and the roof carried patches of moss like old scars. Jack had bought the cabin cheap from a logger who had long abandoned it, and he had patched it together with his own hands. To anyone else, it might look like a shack lost in the woods, but to Jack, it was the first place in years where the world did not demand anything of him. Beside him sat Rex, his German shepherd, a 5-year-old male with a thick brown coat and a black saddle marking that ran strong across his back. Rex's ears stood alert even when he was at rest, and his amber eyes held a kind of steady intelligence that Jack trusted more than most men he had served beside. Rex was not just a dog, he was family, partner, the last proof that loyalty could survive the wreckage of war. Jack had rescued him from a military kennel after deployment, where the dog would have been retired and perhaps forgotten. But Jack had seen the same weariness in Rex's gaze that mirrored his own. Both soldier and dog had given too much, and both needed a place where healing might be possible. Jack crouched to pat the dog's head, fingers brushing over the scar on Rex's left ear, a small tear from a fight during service. "You and me, buddy," Jack murmured in a low, gravelly voice, the kind that seemed to come from deep in his chest rather than his throat. Rex leaned against his leg, pressing the weight of his body into Jack's side, as if to remind him he was not alone. That simple pressure was sometimes all that kept Jack from sliding too far into the memories that stalked him at night. Inside Jack's head, the forest was both a refuge and a trap. On good days, the whisper of wind through the pines calmed him, reminding him of childhood camping trips with his father, a stern but kind mechanic who smelled of engine oil and pipe tobacco. On bad days, the same wind carried echoes of mortar blasts, and the crack of branches made him duck instinctively, heart pounding like it had in Baghdad streets. Jack despised how quickly his body betrayed him, how the war lived on inside him, though it was years since he had come home. He had tried city life after discharge, working odd jobs, drinking too much at night, but the noise of traffic and the press of strangers had only sharpened his edges. The cabin had been his last attempt to carve out peace, to escape into the silence. Still, silence could be cruel. It left space for memories. The ambush in a dusty alley that took his friend Carter, a young soldier barely 21, with a grin too wide for war. The screams of civilians caught between gunfire. The lifeless eyes of men he had shot before they shot him. At night, Jack sometimes woke drenched in sweat, Rex pressed against him, growling low, as if sensing demons no one else could see. The dog's warmth was real, grounding, pulling Jack back from the edge of panic. Without Rex, Jack knew the forest might have swallowed him already. That morning, Jack strapped on his old boots, cracked at the seams but still solid, and slung an axe over his shoulder. Chores waited, chopping wood, checking snares, patching the roof where rain had leaked. Living alone meant there was no one else to do them, and though the work was tiring, it gave Jack rhythm, something the army had once provided, but life after war had not. Rex trotted ahead, tail swaying slightly, sniffing the damp ground, ears twitching at the distant sound of a jay's cry. Jack followed, grateful for the distraction of simple labor. He paused at the tree line and looked back at the cabin. It sat in the mist like something out of time, humble but steadfast. For a moment, Jack let himself breathe deeply, filling his lungs with cold, wet air that smelled of moss and soil. He thought about how fragile this peace was. One wrong step, one bad memory, one nightmare too real, and it could all crumble. But as Rex bounded back to him, eyes bright, Jack felt a flicker of something he had not dared to name in years: hope. The forest had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essentials: wood, fire, water, and the bond between a man and his dog. For Jack, it was enough, for now. Morning in the forest always came with the sound of dripping leaves and the faint cry of distant jays, and Jack Miller had learned to rise with the slow light that bled through the mist. He had slept poorly again, the same recurring dream of a street lined with rubble and the echo of an explosion that tore his friend Carter from his side. But when Jack opened his eyes and saw Rex stretched out at the foot of his bed, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, something inside him steadied. Rex was not just a dog. He was proof that Jack had not been completely abandoned by life. Jack pulled on his faded jeans, beige shirt, and the same boots cracked at the seams, then stepped outside. The air smelled of wet pine needles and smoke from last night's fire. Rex padded after him, tail low but wagging slightly, amber eyes alert. The dog was 5 years old, strong but carrying a gravity in his gaze that Jack often recognized as a mirror of his own. Together they walked to the woodpile. Jack hefted his axe, its handle worn smooth, and began splitting logs for the day. Each swing was measured, and with each thud, Rex circled the clearing, sniffing the earth, pausing to glance at his master, as if making sure he was still there. Later, Jack carried the logs inside, built a fire, and sat on the porch with a battered fishing rod propped against the wall. Fishing was less about food and more about calm, the rhythm of casting line into the quiet stream half a mile away. That morning, he decided to walk there. Rex bounded ahead, ears pricked, occasionally pausing to wait for Jack. The path wound between tall firs, where shafts of sunlight cut through like cathedral windows. Jack remembered walking paths like these as a boy with his father. But back then, his father's stride had been brisk, purposeful, and conversation was scarce. His father, Henry Miller, had been a mechanic hardened by Depression-era childhood, his hands permanently stained with grease, his jaw square and unforgiving. Jack remembered him as a man who believed emotion was weakness, a man who taught his son to fight but not to speak of pain. Jack realized now that Rex was the only creature he could confide in without shame. At the stream, Jack baited his hook and cast it, watching the ripples widen. Rex lay nearby on a patch of grass, ears swiveling at every sound. A dragonfly skimmed the water, and for a moment, Jack felt almost human again, almost free from the clutches of memory. Then the sudden crack of a branch behind him made his pulse spike. He whipped his head around, heart racing, but it was only a man emerging from the trees. Jack tightened his grip on the fishing rod instinctively. The newcomer was tall, thin, perhaps in his 50s, with a bent back and long arms that swung like pendulums. His beard was gray and patchy, his face lined by both sun and hardship. He wore overalls patched at the knees and carried a bundle of snares slung over his shoulder. The man raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," the stranger said, voice raspy, like gravel under boots. "Didn't mean to startle you." Name's Walter. Jack studied him. Walter looked like the kind of man who had spent most of his life outdoors, skin weathered, eyes sharp blue like cold river water. Jack sensed caution in his manner, but also a trace of weariness. Walter explained he was checking traps set along the creek, trying to catch rabbits. He spoke simply, without decoration. and Jack noted how his gaze flicked to Rex with interest. Rex growled low in his throat, not in threat but in warning, and Jack put a calming hand on his neck. "He's protective," Jack said, voice flat. Walter nodded. "Good. World doesn't give us much else but a dog's loyalty." He smiled faintly, but it was the smile of a man who knew loss. Jack wondered briefly what ghosts haunted him, but he did not ask. They exchanged a few more words, then Walter shuffled off into the trees, leaving Jack and Rex alone again. On the way back to the cabin, Jack thought about the brief encounter. He realized how much he relied on Rex to mediate every interaction. Without the dog, Jack would have avoided Walter entirely, but Rex's presence anchored him, gave him the courage to stand still. That evening, Jack sat by the fireplace, flames dancing orange on the log walls. He spooned stew from a dented pot while Rex lay at his feet, nose twitching at the smell. Jack spoke aloud, not really expecting an answer. "You're all I've got left, Rex. You know that, don't you?" Rex lifted his head, eyes catching the firelight, and thumped his tail once. That single gesture carried more comfort than words could. As night settled, Jack thought about Carter again, about the men he had left behind. The guilt pressed heavy, whispering that he should not have survived. But when his gaze dropped to Rex, scarred ear, steady chest, loyal eyes, he reminded himself that survival had a purpose. Perhaps it was to protect this dog, perhaps to learn to live again. Rex was not just his companion, he was his reason. And in the silence of the forest, where shadows stretched long and memories prowled like wolves, that reason was enough to keep Jack breathing through another night. The afternoon carried a gray haze as the mist thickened between the trees, dampening the air and muffling the usual chatter of birds. Jack Miller had spent much of the day repairing the roof shingles of his cabin, and now walked the wooded path with Rex at his side, hoping to clear his head with a quiet stroll. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, the air heavy with the earthy scent of moss. Rex moved ahead with his usual alert stride, his ears pricking at the faintest sound, tail low but steady. Jack let his gaze rest on the trees, tall sentinels that had become both his shelter and his watchmen. His thoughts had drifted, as they often did, to Walter, the trapper he had met the other day by the creek. He wondered about the man's life, about the loneliness etched into his face, and whether every soul who found their way to these woods was running from something. The silence broke with a rustle in the brush to their left. Rex stiffened, ears cutting sharply forward, nose twitching. Before Jack could call out, the dog lunged into the undergrowth, his powerful body disappearing into the thick green. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. "Rex!" he shouted, voice raw. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold, a rattling, harsh, and sinister, followed by Rex's piercing yelp of pain. Jack crashed through the brush, branches clawing at his shirt, until he saw Rex twisting on the ground, his front leg pulled up against his body, fur already wet and clumped with blood. A rattlesnake, thick-bodied and mottled brown, recoiled, its triangular head raised in warning, fangs dripping venom. Its rattle buzzed again, low and furious. Jack's first instinct was violence. His hand flew to the hunting knife strapped at his belt. His body coiled with rage, but before he could strike, the snake slid backward into a dark crack between two rocks and vanished as if swallowed by the earth. Dropping to his knees, Jack gathered Rex into his arms. The dog's weight sagged against him, his eyes wide with pain, his breaths ragged and shallow. The bite mark on the leg was angry and swelling, 2 punctures already reddening, blood mixing with saliva and dirt. Jack's hands shook as he tried to press a cloth torn from his shirt against the wound, but it felt useless, pathetic against something as merciless as venom. He muttered, voice breaking, "No, not you. Not you." Rex's panic surged through him. He knew enough from deployment years to recognize the speed at which venom worked. He remembered a boy in Baghdad, bitten by a desert viper, his face turning gray before the medics could arrive. Jack's chest constricted at the memory. He cursed his own helplessness, tears stinging his eyes as he cradled the dog closer, Rex's head drooping against his arm. The forest pressed in on him with suffocating silence. He wanted to scream, but all that came out was a hoarse whisper. "If I lose you, I've got nothing left." Rex's ears flicked faintly. At his voice, a weak sign of recognition, and that tiny movement tore Jack open. He pressed his forehead against the dog's, trembling, his voice falling into fragments of prayer. A sudden crack of twigs made Jack jerk his head up. From between the trees, a figure approached. Sarah, a woman he had seen once at the edge of town during a rare supply trip months ago. He remembered her vaguely as the keeper of a small general store by the logging road, though they had never spoken. Now she appeared like an apparition, a tall woman in her late 30s with long dark hair braided down her back, her skin pale against a brown wool cloak. Her frame was slender but strong, the kind of strength born not of luxury, but of years carrying burdens alone. Her eyes, sharp hazel under arched brows, widened as she saw the scene. Jack's instinct was to shield Rex, to hide his weakness. But Sarah's voice cut through, steady and practical. "Snakebite?" she asked, already stepping closer. Jack could only nod, words choking in his throat. Sarah knelt, skirts brushing the damp earth, and leaned over the dog. Her hands were long-fingered and quick, unfastening a small satchel she carried. She produced a strip of cloth and a small flask. "Keep him still. We've no time." Jack looked at her, stunned. "You know what to do?" Sarah didn't glance up. "My father was a rancher in Wyoming. We lost too many animals to rattlers. You learn if you want to keep anything alive out here." There was no hesitation in her voice, only a quiet resolve that startled Jack. She tied the cloth above the wound as a crude tourniquet, then poured the contents of the flask over the bite. The liquid stung, Rex whined weakly, but the bleeding slowed. "It's not a cure," she said quickly, "but it buys him time." Jack's chest heaved with a mix of gratitude and desperation. He watched as Sarah worked, her face set in determination. She seemed like someone who had long carried responsibility others abandoned. There was no softness in her expression, but no cruelty either, just the strength of someone who had endured enough hardship to stop waiting for others to step in. When she finished, Sarah looked Jack directly in the eyes. "He needs rest, and herbs, if we can find them. Creosote, mesquite, both grow near the dry ridges. Do you have a fire at your cabin?" "Yes," Jack rasped. "Then let's get him there." Jack adjusted Rex in his arms, the dog's limp body heavy against him, and staggered to his feet. His boots slid on damp leaves, but Sarah steadied his elbow with surprising firmness. They began the slow trek back, Jack clutching Rex as though the dog were a child. His mind reeled with fear and guilt. Every step hammered in the thought, "If Rex dies, I will not survive it." By the time they reached the cabin clearing, the light had begun to fade, the mist thickening into evening gloom. Jack laid Rex on the blanket by the fireplace, his hands trembling as he stroked the dog's head. Sarah moved briskly, already searching the shelves and jars Jack had collected for cooking. "We'll make do with what's here until I can gather more," she murmured. Jack sat back on his heels, watching her. His heart thundered, torn between suspicion. Who was this woman showing up now? And the desperate relief that someone, anyone, had come when he needed it most. His eyes burned with tears as he whispered again, "Hold on, Rex. Hold on." The night closed around the cabin, and with it came the truth that Jack had long avoided. Rex was not just his companion, but his last lifeline, and if the forest chose to take him, it would take Jack's reason to live as well. The cabin walls trembled faintly under the push of night wind, and the firelight flickered across Jack Miller's worn face as he pressed his arms around Rex, the dog's body heavy, limp, and shivering. The wound on Rex's leg had swollen, the skin around the punctures red and angry, fur clotted with dark blood. Jack's breath came uneven, a mixture of curses and prayers whispered under his breath. Sarah, tall and pale with her hazel eyes sharp in the dim light, stood near the door, as though ready to guard against a threat she could not name. Her braid had unraveled during the rush back to the cabin, strands of dark hair framing her weary features. She clutched her cloak tighter around her jaw clenched, but her gaze stayed locked on Jack and the dog. The air shifted suddenly, carrying with it the scent of sage and wood smoke not from Jack's hearth. The door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, framed by the mist that hung at the forest's edge. She was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, her frame straight though age lined her face. Long black hair streaked with gray fell in a thick braid across her shoulder, and her bronze skin bore the weather of years beneath the sun. Her eyes were dark, glimmering like obsidian, steady and unflinching. She wore a deerskin jacket, stitched with beads and muted patterns of turquoise and bone, and a necklace of shells and carved wood lay against her chest. In her right hand she carried a stick carved with symbols, in her left a pouch that bulged with dried herbs and roots. Jack tensed immediately, his hand twitching toward the hunting knife at his belt. The sudden entrance of a stranger ignited every instinct left to him, from war, mistrust, fear, the readiness for violence. But the woman's voice broke through, low and calm, with an accent that carried the rhythm of old languages. "The dog is bitten. Rattler." I smelled the venom in the air. Sarah exhaled audibly and stepped forward. "Ayanna," she said, relief softening her features. "Thank God you came." Jack blinked between them, his voice hoarse. "You know her?" "Yes," Sarah answered quickly, her tone a mix of respect and urgency. "Ayanna lives near the river bend, 2 ridges over. She's Apache, a healer. Knows what none of us can." Ayanna walked forward, her steps deliberate, as though she had entered scenes like this many times before, where suspicion met desperation. She lowered herself beside Rex without asking, setting the pouch onto the floorboards with a soft thud. Her fingers moved with quiet authority, drawing out leaves of creosote, brittle and sharp-scented, and strips of dark mesquite bark. Jack wanted to protest, to demand what she thought she was doing with his dog, but Sarah's firm hand touched his shoulder. "If you want Rex to live, let her work." Ayanna glanced up once at Jack, her eyes meeting his, and in them he saw neither pity nor arrogance, only certainty. Then she bent back to her task. She spread a flat stone in the hearth fire until it glowed faintly, then began grinding the creosote leaves against another stone, releasing their pungent odor. The cabin quickly filled with the smell, acrid, biting, laced with an edge of strange sweetness. Jack coughed, his eyes watering, but Ayanna continued without pause, her long fingers nimble, practiced. She mixed in the splintered mesquite bark until the texture was coarse and fragrant, then pressed the mixture together into a paste. When she set it onto the heated stone, smoke rose in curling tendrils, pale and dense, drifting toward the rafters. Jack felt his skin prickle, the air thickening until every breath carried the weight of resin and earth. Ayanna took a small pouch from her jacket, untying it carefully. Inside was a fine red powder. She sprinkled it in a slow, unbroken circle around Rex's wounded leg, each movement precise, her lips murmuring words in a language Jack did not know. His chest clenched tighter. This was too strange, too much like ritual, and yet he dared not interrupt. Rex's body trembled weakly against his hands, his breaths ragged. Jack pressed his forehead against the dog's head, whispering, "Stay with me, boy. Please, don't leave me too." Ayanna dipped her hands into the paste and pressed it firmly over the puncture wound, sealing the bite beneath the thick, dark smear. Rex flinched, whining faintly, but then lay still. Ayanna's voice rose, not loud, but rhythmic. A chant or a prayer, carried low, steady as a heartbeat. Jack, despite himself, felt his mind pulled by the sound. It reminded him of his mother humming lullabies, of nights before war, of voices that carried safety. Minutes dragged into something timeless. Jack's knees ached from crouching, his arms numb from holding Rex. But he did not move. Sarah stood silently, her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on the healer, as if guarding the fragile thread of hope being woven. At last, Ayanna leaned back, wiping sweat from her brow. The paste clung to Rex's leg like a seal, the red circle around him unbroken. She exhaled deeply, her shoulders lowering, and said, "The venom will not win tonight. He breathes still. Keep him warm. Do not let the paste wash. By dawn, you will know if he fights to live." Jack stared at her, disbelief and gratitude colliding inside him. His throat burned as he whispered, "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, too small for the weight of what she had done. Ayanna met his gaze again, her expression unreadable, her voice calm. "Do not thank me. Thank the earth that gave us what we needed, and thank him," she nodded toward Rex, For choosing to stay, Jack bent over Rex, pressing his face into the dog's fur, tears spilling freely for the first time in years. He clutched Rex close, whispering fragments of prayer, fragments of memory. Outside, the forest moaned with wind, but inside, the scent of smoke and herbs wrapped around them like a fragile shield. For that night, Jack was no longer alone in his despair. He was a soldier cradling his last comrade, watching as life and death waged war over the body of a dog, while an Apache healer whispered hope into the air. The cabin was heavy with smoke and silence, the scent of resin and herbs clinging to the air as though the walls themselves had soaked it in. Jack Miller sat slumped against the rough boards, his arms wrapped around Rex, the German shepherd's head resting limply on his thigh. The paste Ayanna had pressed over the bite still clung like a dark patch on the swollen leg, and the faint circle of red earth around him marked the floor like a fragile barrier between life and death. The fire hissed as sap popped inside the logs, its glow casting the room in trembling shadows. Jack's face was streaked with grime and sweat, but his eyes were fixed on the dog, watching each rise and fall of his chest as if counting the breaths could keep him alive. His hair, chestnut-streaked with silver, clung damp to his forehead, and his beard bristled with the roughness of long days without care. He had fought in deserts where men died without reason. He had buried friends with his own hands, yet now, in this small cabin, he found himself undone by the sight of a dog barely clinging to life. Sarah stood near the window, tall and pale, her hazel eyes softened by firelight. She had removed her wool cloak, revealing a plain brown dress worn from years of use. Stray strands of her dark braid clung to her cheek, and there was a stillness in her face that suggested she had weathered storms of her own. She said nothing, but her presence filled the space with an unspoken strength. She looked like a woman who had carried grief before and learned to stand upright despite it, her hands clasped before her as though steadying herself. Ayanna sat cross-legged on the floor by the hearth, her deerskin jacket draped loosely over her shoulders, her eyes closed, lips moving faintly as if whispering to unseen spirits. The carved stick rested in her lap, and though she made no sound that Jack could clearly hear, he felt her presence like a steadying drumbeat, unseen but undeniable. Jack pressed his forehead into Rex's damp fur, his voice breaking loose in ragged fragments. "I can't do this again," he whispered. His hands shook, clutching at the dog's body. "I've buried too many already. Carter in the alley, Daniel under the sand, my own brother in a box back home. I've watched them all go into the ground, and every time I thought maybe that would be the last. But it never ends. It just keeps taking." The words tumbled out of him, hoarse and uneven, as though years of silence had split open at once. He remembered his wife's face, tired and lined with disappointment, the day she walked out the door with her suitcase. He remembered the daughter he had only seen in pictures, her childhood passing without him. His voice rose, thick with guilt. "I lost them too, not by death, but by my own damn hands. I brought the war home with me. I chased them away." His chest heaved, and the tears came, hot and bitter, falling onto Rex's matted fur. Sarah's eyes flickered, with something unspoken, but she remained quiet, watching him as though she knew that silence was the only answer worth giving. Ayanna finally opened her eyes, deep and unreadable, but she did not interrupt. She let his grief fill the cabin, let the words soak into the wood and the smoke until they no longer crushed only him. Jack sobbed openly, the sound tearing from him like shrapnel. It startled him, how raw and unrestrained it was. He had not cried when they folded the flag at Carter's funeral, nor when the shells landed inches from his head, nor even when his wife told him she could not love the man he had become. But here, with Rex slipping away, the dam had broken. Rex stirred faintly under his arms, letting out a low whine as if responding to the flood of emotion. Jack stroked his ears, his tears dampening the dog's coat. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for all the times I pushed too hard, for all the nights I leaned on you like you were the only thing keeping me upright. You didn't ask for this. You never asked to carry my ghosts." Sarah stepped closer then, kneeling quietly on the other side of Rex. She reached out and placed her hand lightly on the dog's paw. Her voice was steady, almost maternal. "Dogs don't carry our ghosts, Jack. They chase them away, one bark at a time, one look that says we're not alone." He's not burdened, he's your anchor." Jack looked at her, his eyes swollen, his breath hitching. For the first time he saw her not as a stranger, but as someone who had known what it meant to cling to something fragile just to keep moving forward. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression neither pitying nor cold, but firm, as if daring him to believe her words. Ayana's voice came low, calm, like the settling of embers. "Your tears are medicine too. They wash the poison you've carried here." She tapped lightly against her own chest, over her heart. "Not only the snake brings venom. You've lived with it inside you for years." Jack swallowed hard, his body trembling as the truth of her words pressed into him. He held Rex tighter, rocking slightly, his sobs quieting into a steady rhythm of breath and grief. The fire burned lower, the shadows lengthened, but the weight on his chest eased, little by little, as though the act of speaking had lightened the load he had carried for too long. As dawn crept toward the cabin, gray light pushing through the window cracks, Jack finally felt his body loosen. His tears had slowed, leaving tracks on his dirt-streaked cheeks. Rex's breathing, though still shallow, had steadied. Jack pressed his lips against the dog's head and whispered, "Stay. Just stay with me. I'll carry the rest." For the first time in years, his tears did not feel like weakness. They felt like a man finally remembering how to be human. The night seemed endless. Every creak of the old cabin felt like the world holding its breath. Every gust of wind through the pine trees carried a weight heavier than silence. Jack Miller had not closed his eyes once. His body ached, his arms stiff from holding Rex, but he did not let go. His mind, scarred by the discipline of war, refused to surrender to sleep. Instead, it ran in circles, back to the battlefield, forward to an empty future, always stopping at the present where the dog he loved might not make it to morning. Rex lay motionless, his body pressed against Jack's lap, fur matted where blood had dried beneath Ayana's thick herbal paste. The once powerful German shepherd, his shoulders broad and his chest proud, now looked small and frail. His amber eyes had been closed for hours, and his breaths came shallow, uneven. Jack bent close to feel the faint stir of air on his cheek, terrified each time the rhythm paused longer than it should. Sarah sat in a wooden chair near the fire, her tall frame leaning forward, her dark braid undone, so that loose strands fell against her pale skin. Exhaustion pulled at her features, but she stayed awake, her hazel eyes never leaving the fragile tableau of man and dog. She had lost people too. Jack could see it in the way she clenched her hands, the way her shoulders stiffened at every sound. Her silence was not indifference, but solidarity, a quiet sharing of the vigil. Ayana remained by the hearth, her legs folded neatly, her posture impossibly steady. She looked as if she belonged to another world, one untouched by fear. The firelight revealed the strong lines of her bronze face, the creases at the corners of her eyes etched from years beneath sun and sorrow. She murmured prayers under her breath, sometimes so low Jack thought he imagined them. The carved stick rested across her lap, her fingers brushing at symbols as though drawing strength from each mark. Time dragged on. Jack whispered fragments of memory into Rex's ears. The first day they met at the shelter, the long walks through the Oregon trails, the nights when nightmares pulled him from sleep and Rex's steady breathing pulled him back. His voice cracked with fatigue, but he kept talking, afraid that silence might be permission for death to come closer. Then it happened. Just as the sky outside the window began to pale with the first promise of dawn, Rex's body shuddered faintly. Jack froze. For a heartbeat he feared it was the last spasm of life leaving, but then the dog's flank lifted more deliberately. Rex gave a small, weak whine and shifted his head against Jack's leg. His amber eyes opened, cloudy but alive, and blinked against the dim light. Jack's throat closed. He could not form words. Instead, a sob escaped him, raw and broken, but this time mixed with relief. He cradled Rex closer, pressing his face into the dog's fur, tears flowing freely. "You stubborn old soldier," he whispered hoarsely. "You damn well stayed." Sarah gasped quietly, her hand flying to her mouth. The hard edge in her eyes melted, replaced by something tender. She stood and stepped closer, kneeling beside them, her long fingers stroking Rex's ear gently. "He's a fighter," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. Just like his master. Ayanna allowed herself the faintest of smiles. She did not speak, but her eyes, dark and still, glimmered with the knowledge of what had passed. She reached forward, laying her hand briefly on Rex's back, then on Jack's shoulder. The circle held, she murmured at last. The earth answered. Jack lifted his head to meet her gaze, his own eyes swollen, his face streaked with ash and tears. "You saved him," he said. His voice cracked, thick with gratitude. Ayanna shook her head slowly, her gray-streaked braid falling against her chest. "I guided what was already here. Life is stubborn. Love is stubborn. That is what saved him." Outside, the forest woke. The mist began to lift, curling upward as pale shafts of light pierced through the trees. The cry of a hawk echoed faintly, followed by the rustle of small creatures stirring in the undergrowth. When the first beam of sunlight spilled through the cabin window and touched Rex's eyes, his amber gaze caught the light. For a fleeting moment, it looked as if fire had returned to them, not in pain, but in quiet strength. Jack closed his eyes and let the warmth wash over him. For years, he had believed miracles belonged to other men, or to stories told in chapels he no longer entered. But here, in this small cabin, with a dog's heartbeat under his palm and the rising sun painting the world gold, he found himself believing again. He held Rex tighter, whispering into his fur, "You and me, boy. We're not done. Not yet." The days that followed Rex's recovery unfolded like a second chance Jack Miller never expected to receive. Each morning began with pale sunlight filtering through the tall Oregon pines, scattering across the mossy ground and spilling into the clearing where his cabin stood. The forest, once a place that mirrored his isolation, now seemed alive with quiet purpose. The sound of wind in the needles no longer carried only loneliness. It carried the pulse of continuity, of something worth tending. Jack kept his promise to Ayanna. At first it was clumsy. He had spent years handling rifles and wrenches, not roots and leaves. His hands were broad, scarred, with calluses that spoke of war and work, and he often crushed the delicate herbs instead of grinding them evenly. Still, he watched Ayanna closely as she demonstrated, her movements patient and deliberate. She showed him how to strip mesquite bark without splintering it, how to gather creosote leaves when their oil was strongest, and how to burn them so the smoke cleansed rather than suffocated. Ayanna's presence was steady, almost solemn, though there were moments when a softness peeked through. She was a woman in her 50s, her long black hair streaked with silver, her skin weathered by sun and years of labor. Her voice was low, melodic, and when she spoke of the plants, it carried reverence, as if she was speaking not of medicine, but of old friends. She rarely smiled, yet when she caught Jack fumbling or muttering under his breath, the corners of her mouth bent just enough to reveal that she was not made of stone. Rex often lingered nearby, his gait still slower than before, his amber eyes following Jack's every move. The German shepherd was recovering. His fur had grown back where the herbs had been applied, though a dark scar ringed the wound like a medal. He carried himself with less vigor, but there was no mistaking the loyalty in the way he rested his head on Jack's boot while the veteran practiced mixing pastes. To Jack, it felt as if Rex too was learning. Sarah, who had stayed longer than she first intended, often joined them in the afternoons. She was tall and slender, with an elegance dulled not by hardship, but by familiarity with it. Her hazel eyes seemed more at ease now, and her laughter, when it came, was unguarded. She admitted she had once been a schoolteacher before losing her husband to illness, and perhaps it was this past that made her voice gentle when she corrected Jack's awkward attempts to recite the names of plants Ayanna taught him. She spoke with warmth, as if to remind him he was no longer walking this road alone. Soon, word of Ayanna's healing, and of Jack's growing role beside her, spread beyond the forest. It began quietly. A farmer named Thomas Wilkes came one evening, leading a mule with a swollen leg. Thomas was a stocky man in his 60s, his hair thinning, his face lined with both laughter and toil. He had lived alone for years after, losing his wife, his only company the mule and a few goats. Jack, nervous, applied the salve under Ayanna's watchful eye, and within days Thomas returned, grateful, with a sack of apples as thanks. Then others came, a mother carrying her feverish son, an old logger with a persistent cough, a young girl with a sprained ankle. Each time, Ayana guided Jack, showing him how to balance herbs with care, how to listen as much as treat, and how silence could heal just as well as medicine. Jack found himself listening more than speaking, and slowly people began to stay, not only for help, but for companionship. The cabin transformed. Its porch, once a place where Jack sat in solitude with his rifle and memories, now became a gathering place. Children brought him small loaves of bread or drawings in exchange for his gruff but kind attention. Elderly men lingered to share stories of logging days, their weathered hands gesturing with animation. Women offered pies and knitted scarves, laughing when Rex tried to sneak a bite. The sound of voices filled the once quiet clearing, blending with the forest itself, until Jack could no longer imagine the silence without them. Rex adjusted too. The dog, who had once been a sentinel of Jack's loneliness, now stretched out lazily on the porch, his dark saddle of fur rising and falling with steady breaths. His ears still perked at every new arrival, but his tail wagged with ease, as if he understood that the danger had given way to fellowship. Children would scratch behind his ears, and Rex would close his eyes, content to soak in their affection. For Jack, it was bewildering at first. He had lived so long expecting abandonment that when people returned instead of turning away, he did not know how to respond. Yet, with each passing day, he felt something loosen inside him. The walls he had built from grief and guilt softened, brick by brick, replaced with the laughter of children and the gratitude of neighbors. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the forest gold, Jack sat on the porch with Rex at his side, Sarah rocking gently in a chair, and Ayana quietly weaving beads into a strip of leather. He watched the light catch on Rex's amber eyes and felt an ache of gratitude so deep it nearly unmade him. He realized that the miracle had not been only that Rex survived the snakebite. The miracle was that in saving his dog, he had learned to save himself. The summer evening draped the Oregon forest in a violet haze, the long fingers of dusk stretching across the clearing where Jack Miller's cabin now stood, transformed. Once it had been a refuge of silence, its walls holding back loneliness. Now, laughter and the murmur of voices often spilled from its porch, mixing with the steady chirp of crickets and the rustle of pine boughs. The cabin was no longer just a shelter for one broken man and his dog. It had become a place where the scattered threads of a community came together. Jack stood on the porch, his hand resting gently on Rex's back. The German shepherd's gait had slowed since the snakebite, and the scar on his leg showed dark beneath the tan fur. Yet his amber eyes still gleamed with intelligence, and when children came to scratch his ears, his tail beat against the wooden boards. To Jack, that scar was not a mark of weakness, but a banner of survival. It mirrored the invisible wound he carried within himself, both a reminder of pain and a testament to endurance. Sarah moved about inside, her tall frame visible through the open door, as she laid out jars of herbs and bandages on the table. The evening light caught in her hazel eyes and traced the curve of her cheek, softening the strength she carried in her posture. She had stayed longer than she once promised, becoming less a guest and more a part of the rhythm of the cabin. Her hands, once used to chalk and books in a classroom, now prepared poultices with ease. The grief she bore had not left her, but it had learned to sit quietly beside her instead of consuming her. Ayana arrived as she often did at twilight, her figure cutting a calm silhouette against the darkening trees. She carried her pouch of herbs, its strap worn from years of use. Her long braid, streaked with silver, swung gently as she walked, and the beads at her necklace caught what little light remained. She had taught Jack to recognize more than plants. She had taught him patience, and how to listen without the urge to fill silence. Tonight she spoke little, simply resting by the fire pit outside, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as though she measured not just weather, but the balance of things unseen. Neighbors gathered as they had grown accustomed to do. Thomas Wilkes, the stocky farmer with thinning hair, arrived with a basket of pears. He chuckled as Rex nosed at his hand, muttering, "You'll outlive us all, old boy." A young widow named Margaret, round-faced with auburn hair pinned neatly, came with her 2 sons. The boys darted across the clearing until Rex barked once, low and firm, and they returned sheepishly, giggling. Old Harold, a logger with a beard gone mostly white and a limp from years of hauling timber, settled into a chair by the porch with a sigh of satisfaction, puffing a pipe that smelled of cedar. Jack greeted each one, his voice still gruff, his manner still edged with the remnants of a soldier's caution. Yet there was warmth. In his eyes, a gentleness in the way he carried wood for Harold, or lifted Margaret's youngest to the porch. For so long he had believed his war wounds and his solitude had separated him from others. Now he discovered they were bridges, ways to connect through shared hurt and healing. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of purple and rose, Jack stepped down from the porch and lifted Rex into his arms. The dog no longer had the strength for long climbs, but he rested calmly against Jack's chest, his head leaning against the veteran's shoulder. Together they stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the expanse of forest. The light bled across the treetops, tinting them violet. Jack felt the cool evening air settle on his skin, smelled the resin of pine, and let the quiet fill him. His voice came low, almost reverent, as he whispered into Rex's ear, "The Lord leaves the wounds, so we can find the gift." His eyes burned, but not with grief, with gratitude. The scar in his chest felt less like an emptiness now and more like a vessel being slowly filled, with faith, with fellowship, with love. Behind him, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Children's laughter drifted out, mingling with the rumble of men's conversation and the clatter of Sarah's steady hands. Ayanna sat in silence, her lips curving in the faintest of knowing smiles. For the first time in years, Jack did not feel like an exile. He felt like a man who had found his place again, scars and all. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now pulsed with life. It was no longer just a veteran's retreat. It was a home of faith, community, and the love of a dog who had carried him through his darkest night. Jack Miller's journey began in silence, carrying scars no one could see. All he had left was a loyal German shepherd named Rex. And when that bond nearly slipped away to a rattlesnake's fangs, Jack discovered something greater than survival. Through Ayanna's healing hands, Sarah's quiet presence, and the kindness of neighbors who once felt like strangers, he learned that brokenness can be the soil where hope grows. The scar on Rex's leg and the scar in Jack's heart became more than reminders of pain. They became symbols of endurance. The cabin that once echoed with loneliness now brimmed with voices, laughter, and the warmth of a community reborn. Jack finally understood. God sometimes allows wounds, not to punish, but to reveal gifts we could not see otherwise: faith, friendship, and the strength to carry one another. The miracle was not just that Rex lived, but that Jack found life again, stitched together by love and loyalty. Scars remind us that God still has work for us to do. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Drop a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more K9 stories of faith and redemption, and may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, healing, and courage every single day.